March 3, 1943, a day that would forever change the course of naval warfare in the Pacific. Admiral Masato Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, surveying the horizon as his convoy made its way through the Bismarck Sea. 8 destroyers escorted 8 fully loaded transport ships, carrying the crucial reinforcements that Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi desperately needed on the front lines in Lae, New Guinea. Little did Kimura know, this was no ordinary convoy. What seemed like a routine operation would soon become a deadly trap. The convoy carried over 6,000 soldiers and vital supplies, and Kimura was confident that the Japanese Navy's superiority in these waters, established over months of dominance, would ensure their safe passage. The seas had long been patrolled by the Imperial Navy, and no serious threat had surfaced to challenge their dominance. But what Kimura could never have anticipated was the American innovation waiting for him just beyond the horizon. In Australian workshops, mechanics had transformed medium bombers into something that would strike fear into the hearts of Japanese naval officers. Modified B25 Mitchell bombers, equipped with 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns, would soon descend on the convoy like a swarm of mechanical demons. These American bombers had been redesigned with one purpose: to destroy ships at low altitudes with a devastating barrage of firepower. As the convoy sailed deeper into the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese had no idea that the very air they thought was safe would soon become a killing field. In the words of one survivor, it was like nothing we had ever imagined possible. The convoy had been in motion for hours, its soldiers unaware of the impending storm. As the first American aircraft appeared on the radar, Lieutenant Commander Aikata aboard the Japanese destroyer Asashio reported multiple contacts. They appeared to be B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, the type the Japanese had become accustomed to, high in the sky, a threat they had faced countless times before. The convoy's anti-aircraft crews swung their guns into position, ready for a familiar battle. But then, the unexpected happened. At just 1,500 feet above the waves, a fleet of B-25 Mitchell bombers converted into flying gunships appearing out of the ocean's mist like ghosts. The crews aboard the transports and destroyers had never seen anything like them. These American bombers were not just designed to drop bombs, they were now armed to the teeth, their noses bristling with 8 50-caliber machine guns. The Japanese sailors, once confident in their defenses, suddenly faced a nightmare. Their anti-aircraft guns fired furiously at the bombers, but the low-flying aircraft were too fast, too close. There was no time to adjust the fire, no time to react. The convoy's destroyers tried evasive maneuvers, but these new American bombers made it clear evasive tactics had become obsolete. Major Edward Lair, a pilot in the 90th Bombardment Squadron, led the first wave of B-25 seconds. His aircraft, ruthless, came in low, under the radar. As he approached the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki, he could see the faces of the sailors on the deck, stunned and confused. They had no idea what was coming for them. Nur squeezed the trigger, and in an instant, 8 streams of fire erupted from his aircraft, cutting through the Shirayuki's bridge and superstructure. The machine guns were relentless, tearing apart the ship's vital components before Elner dropped his bombs. They skipped across the water and slammed into the hull, causing explosions that rocked the destroyer and set her on fire. What followed was chaos. More B-25 seconds, along with Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, descended on the convoy, relentlessly attacking transports and destroyers alike. The Japanese were powerless against the concentrated firepower. Within minutes, a well-coordinated, precise attack had turned the once formidable convoy into a burning wreck. One Japanese sailor, Takashi Mieta, later recalled the terror he felt as the B-25 Strafers cut through the ship. He described the experience as being caught in a giant metal cutting saw. His words would echo throughout the surviving crew members, who had witnessed firsthand the horror of facing a new kind of aerial warfare. The Japanese Navy had underestimated the American ability to adapt and innovate. What had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress of ships and anti-aircraft defenses had been shattered in a matter of minutes. The attack on the convoy was swift, but the consequences would last far longer. Within minutes of the first assault, the Japanese destroyers had become targets for the relentless B-25 Strafers. The once proud fleet, moving with precision and confidence, was now scattered and disoriented, trying to stay afloat amidst the explosions and chaos. Captain Tamachihara aboard the destroyer, Shiryuki watched helplessly as his crew was torn apart by the hail of machine gun fire. It was as if the ship itself was being sawed in half, he later wrote. The B-25's forward-firing guns pierced the ship's bridge, killing the officers who had orchestrated the convoy's defense. Those who survived were forced to fight fires and flooding, but it was already too late. The sight of Shiryuki sinking was just the beginning. In the water, chaos reigned. The survivors scrambled to abandon ship, only to find that the B-25 seconds had not finished their deadly work. One by one, the transport ships, including the Kembaru, Kaakushi Maru, and Tio Maru, became targets for the relentless strafers. The pilots lined up their shots with cold precision, pouring fire into the decks of the ships. Lieutenant John Henebri, piloting the B-25 Sleepy Time Gal, recalled the devastation as his rounds tore into the Kaakushi Maru's bridge, killing the captain and most of the crew. His skip bombs struck the hull, tearing the ship apart. For every ship that sank, another one was disabled, its crew left to fight fires or drown in the rising water. What made this battle different was the nature of the American attack. The Japanese had always believed their defense against aircraft was invincible. Their destroyers' anti-aircraft guns had turned away countless bombers. But the B-25 seconds had found a new approach: low-altitude strafing, where the fighters were too fast to target, and the low altitude made it impossible to escape the barrage of bullets. The psychological toll on the Japanese was just as devastating as the physical. Survivors who had escaped the flames spoke of the constant fear of being targeted again. "We were like animals in a slaughterhouse," one sailor later described. There was no place to hide. The B-25 seconds came again and again, always at us, never stopping. But amidst the devastation, there were moments of sacrifice and heroism. Captain Yasumi Doi, aboard the destroyer Tokitaki, tried desperately to rally his crew. Despite the hopelessness of their situation, he ordered evasive maneuvers and directed fire toward the incoming bombers. But his crew was decimated, and his ship was also soon disabled, sinking beneath the waves. The Japanese Navy had never experienced an attack like this. And in those few hours over the Bismarck Sea, the battle was lost not just because of the destruction of the ships, but because of the psychological impact this new kind of warfare had on the survivors. By the time the last B-25 Mitchell bomber had disappeared into the horizon, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. The Japanese convoy, once a symbol of naval strength, had been shattered beyond recognition. The once carefully coordinated formation was now a scattered wreckage, with burning ships sinking one after another. In just a matter of hours, the death toll had surged. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors lost their lives. Admiral Masato Kimura, helpless on his flagship, could only watch as his convoy turned into a mass of flames. His flagship Shiryuki had been sunk, and his remaining ships were heavily damaged, their decks covered with the bodies of the fallen. It was not just the ships that were lost, but the hope of reinforcements for the Japanese garrisons in New Guinea. The devastation was not just a tactical loss, it was a catastrophic blow to Japan's ability to sustain its forces in the region. The human cost was staggering. Of the 6,900 soldiers aboard the convoy, fewer than 1,200 would survive. Many were rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after dark, but the majority of the convoy's soldiers were drowned in the cold waters of the Bismarck Sea. Those who had survived the initial bombardment were left to face the overwhelming grief and loss of their comrades. For the Japanese Navy, this was not just a defeat on the battlefield, but a fundamental shift in naval doctrine. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. The realization that American aircraft, once considered ineffective against ships, had now become the dominant force on the seas was a bitter pill to swallow. The Japanese officers who survived the attack were left grappling with the fact that their tactics had failed, and their most trusted defense, their destroyers and anti-aircraft guns, had proven useless against the modified B-25 seconds. As Japanese sailors recovered what was left of the convoy's wreckage, many began to wonder if their tax evasion, once unshakable confidence in their naval superiority, had been shattered forever. Captain Tamachihara, who had survived aboard Shiryuki, would later write, "The attack was like nothing we had ever experienced. We believed in our defenses, but we were powerless against what came at us." The survivors would return to their bases in shame, their morale shattered, while the Japanese leadership began to reevaluate their naval strategies. What had once seemed invincible, both their ships and their tactics, had crumbled in the face of an unexpected innovation. But for the Americans, the victory in the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point. Their innovation had not only proven effective, it had sent shockwaves through the Pacific. The Japanese would never again operate with the same confidence in the airspace near their ships. The consequences of the Bismarck Sea disaster would ripple far beyond the Pacific battlefield. In the weeks and months that followed, the Japanese Navy's leadership faced a crisis of confidence. The convoy's destruction not only decimated their forces, but exposed the vulnerability of their entire naval strategy. What had once seemed like an insurmountable advantage, superior naval power and effective anti-aircraft defenses, had been utterly compromised by a weapon they could neither comprehend nor counter. In the aftermath of the attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, called for an immediate reassessment of Japan's naval strategy. The once unchallenged superiority of the Japanese Navy was now in question. The success of the B-25 Strafers had completely changed the rules of naval warfare in the Pacific. No longer could the Japanese rely on their vast fleet of warships, knowing that low-flying bombers armed with forward-firing guns could destroy them in a matter of minutes. The impact was felt across the Pacific. With their shipping lanes under constant threat from these modified bombers, the Japanese began to suffer severe shortages in supplies, including food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The logistical backbone that had supported their distant garrisons, such as those in New Guinea, was now severely weakened. The garrison at Lae, which the convoy had been intended to reinforce, would eventually be abandoned by the Japanese in September of 1943, a casualty of the relentless American air superiority. The B-25 Strafers' success would resonate for the rest of the war. As the United States ramped up its efforts in the Pacific, these bombers continued to wreak havoc on Japanese shipping, their fearsome reputation growing with each attack. The U.S. forces had not just developed a new weapon. They had created a game-changer. American engineers and pilots had demonstrated the power of innovation, turning a standard bomber into a lethal force capable of reshaping the entire balance of naval power. The legacy of the B-25 Strafer would extend beyond the Pacific War. The concept of heavily armed gunships, capable of striking from low altitudes, would influence military aviation for decades to come. In conflicts such as the Vietnam War, aircraft like the AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre would carry forward the lessons learned from the B-25's success, adapting the concept of strafing to new technologies and new combat environments. For the men who flew these bombers, the B-25 would forever represent the ultimate example of ingenuity in the face of adversity. They had taken a standard bomber and turned it into a weapon that could destroy entire convoys, leaving the Japanese Navy in a state of shock and disarray. Their actions, though often deadly and dangerous, had turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Their legacy was one of relentless courage, quick thinking, and unmatched technical innovation. As the war came to a close in 1945, the U.S. would emerge victorious, and the B-25 Strafer's role in the Pacific would be immortalized in history. But its impact would not end with the war. The stories of those daring pilots, their aircraft covered in bullet holes and painted with nose art, would continue to inspire future generations of aviators and military strategists alike. The B-25 Strafer had not only destroyed Japanese ships, but had also rewritten the future of warfare. As one veteran would later reflect, "We weren't just fighting a war, we were changing history."